Hello, welcome to the next segment of the High School Journalism Workshop online version. My name is Bill Moushey. I'm a professor at Point Park University School of Communication. I've been a reporter for close to 50 years, as hard as that is to believe, and I've never felt like I worked one day in my life. That's why I've been in journalism my whole time, and I hope some of you might find the same treasure that I have. What even made it better for me is I worked a few years in the newspaper business, and then I had my big break, and that is when I got put into a mob trial up in New York, up in Cleveland, that based on New York and all the way across the United States. Covering the mob guys in Cleveland, which were killers, bad guys, really bad guys. I found what I loved, bad guys. My dad was a cop. My mom was the best gossip in my whole neighborhood. So when I got into covering some really bad people, it just stuck. And I might have been 23 or 24 years old when I first started covering the worst people on this earth. And I'm still doing it now at the age of 66. And that's what I want to talk about, how this has evolved in my life. I spent 30 years in journalism catching bad guys doing stuff and putting them in prison. I mean, some of the worst people on this earth that you would ever imagine, who had killed, maimed, cut up bodies, even eaten them on occasion. I ended up getting my big break uncovering bad guys in Cleveland. There was a major mob, La Cosa Nostra war going on in Cleveland. And my boss at Cleveland Magazine, where I worked at the time, put me on this big story of trying to figure out what was going on with all these killings. I ended up writing a major piece for the magazine about the change in leadership in the Cleveland La Cosa Nostra, which is basically what caused all the maiming and killing and all the other things. I was done with the piece, and my boss took me over to Little Italy in Cleveland to have some Italian food to celebrate. And I'm in there, and all of a sudden a big limo pulls up in front of the joint, and out jumps the guy that I wrote about, James Blackie Licavoli. And I'm thinking, that's no big deal, because I tried to interview him, but he didn't talk to me. I just talked to him briefly on the phone when he said, I got nothing to say about nothing. But then out from behind him comes his lawyer, who I had interviewed in person. And the lawyer runs up and said, that's that Moushey guy. That's that Moushey guy from Cleveland Magazine. So the old man comes over to me, and he says, you will write the story? And I said, yes, sir. And then he said, that's okay. You got your job, I got a mine. You come over here and eat lunch with me. And I said, well, no, thank you, sir. No last suppers. But it struck me in that very moment that these bad guys, who supposedly were in the back dark underbelly of life, actually loved it when you write stories about them. And that set me on a path that continues to this day. And I wrote a major story called Protected Witness about the sham of a protected witness program we had, where they paid people millions of dollars. They let killers run free. They let people who killed while they're in the program go. And it was just a horrible mess, which my expose of that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. But while I was piling up all that stuff, I started finding all these cases where there was misconduct, a wide variety of misconduct, where people who may have been criminals, and sometimes people who were not criminals, were being victimized by other people in the system, people who knew how the system worked. That's when I started up the Innocence Project at Point Park University back in right after 9/11. And we ended up doing investigations, my students and me, investigating allegations of wrongful convictions. And we had a role in 19 cases where people were released. That the Innocence Project folded several years ago because of a lack of funding, but now I leave everything for my podcast, winatallcost.com. There are 6 different cases up there right now, and many more to come. I invite you to go look at winatallcost.com. But throughout all this stuff, I spent 30 years putting people in jail. Now I'm spending the rest of my life trying to even the scales of justice, so to speak. And during all of our work in the Innocence Project and continuing in my podcast, I understood that there are 4 basic reasons that people get wrongfully convicted. There's 1, false eyewitness identifications. 2, there are junk science cases where faulty scientific evidence is used to achieve convictions. 3, of course, there are lying snitches. And 4, there's prosecutorial misconduct. Every case I've ever looked at, every case that anybody in the world of wrongful convictions have looked at has found that those 4 areas pretty much resolve every case. Here's an example. Justin Kirkwood was a guy who had never been arrested, lived in Newcastle, PA. He worked in a forgery shop, lived at his parents' house, was 25 years old, and the day before his brother's wedding, he gets arrested for an armed robbery across town that occurred at 7 o'clock at night. The only evidence that existed was the woman who was robbed, the checkout clerk at a family craft store on the North Hill of Newcastle, PA. Justin Kirkwood was making $500 a week. He had no reason. He wasn't a drug addict or anything. He had no reason to rob a store, which, by the way, the robbery netted $176. And there was no way they had any money in the store. It was like you could buy yarn there and things like that. But when the police started doing an investigation, Kirkwood had been charged, and then the charges were dropped in an altercation with his girlfriend, and they happened to take his picture during the times that he was charged, which, by the way, the case was dropped. His picture happened to get into a photo array, and next thing you know, the 2 witnesses, the 2 women who worked at the store, identified Kirkwood as the man who robbed them. They did not identify a long list of tattoos that he had. They didn't get his eyes right, and they didn't get a variety of other things right about him, including the length of his hair and other things. But despite that, Kirkwood, with that eyewitness identification, was convicted and sentenced to prison for as long as 13 years. We got involved at the Innocence Project in the case due to the insistence of his family, because they said there's no way that he did this because he was sitting in our living room when it happened. And then during the course of our work, we found out that the employer of Kirkwood's dad, a car dealer, called exactly at 7 o'clock to tell him that they had a car for him to use in the wedding the next day. That car dealer ended up testifying that he talked to Justin Kirkwood at 7 o'clock. How could he be across town robbing somebody? They thought that was going to get him off the hook until the 2 clerks come in and they said, we identify him. That was him. And that's why he got convicted. Well, he did 3 years in prison before we went at the Innocence Project, figured out that the clerk who made the major identification was legally blind. No one told Kirkwood or his lawyers that, and no one did anything about it. After all that was piled up, a judge granted Kirkwood release and dropped all charges. And the best case that we've ever worked on is Drew Whitley. Drew Whitley was charged with killing a night manager of a McDonald's out by Kennywood Park in Pittsburgh. Whitley at the time was a guy who was sort of a grifter type dude who didn't really do much in life. He was poor. He lived in the projects. He bought goods that were probably stolen and then sold them for low amounts of money. That was basically what he did. At the time, he was on parole for a property crime. He lives about across a parking lot in a project from where the crime occurred. What happened was, right when they were closing the McDonald's, this beautiful young night manager, Noreen Malloy, closed the store, had the money bag with her, and walked out the back door when somebody that had a trench coat of stocking mask over his face, a hat, and a pair of gloves accosted her, asked for the money bag. She refused to give him, so he shot her dead. The next day, one of the employees who had only worked there for 2 days and was sitting on the back steps when all this happened, didn't run, by the way, told police that the guy looked like Drew Whitley. Drew Whitley said he didn't even know the guy, but they said that they thought it was him. Whitley's arrested on a parole violation, and he never saw the light of a free day for another 20 years. What happened was, back then, in the late 70s, there was no DNA evidence that could be tested and used in criminal proceedings. They hadn't perfected the process yet. So they found all these hair follicles, and they brought a hair expert in that says that those were probably Drew Whitley's hair. And then they brought the kid in who said he walked, the assailant walked like he thought Whitley did, although Whitley says he never met the guy. And then they brought a convicted killer, twice convicted killer, in to tell the jury that Whitley confessed to him, despite the fact that jail records showed that they were never in the same area of the prison with each other. But all that set aside, Whitley gets convicted and goes to prison for life. 15 years later, he calls me up to collect from the prison and said, "Hey, I see this new stuff called DNA testing's there, and if there is any way that I can get tested, it'll prove that I did not do this crime because I didn't do it." So that started a process of about 5 years where he went through the courts over and over, getting turned down over and over, trying to get DNA testing. So finally, a judge, Walter Little, just before he died, decided he was going to test it and ordered the county police to turn over some of these hair follicles for testing. The county police came back to the judge and said they lost the follicles. There was a major storm and a flood in downtown Pittsburgh on Wood Street, where the county police was, and they held all their evidence in the basement of the place, and it flooded out and ruined all the stuff. Well, it turns out that when we checked the chain of custody, it turned out that the hair follicles were in the county police possession after the flood, meaning they didn't get ruined in the flood. Now, there was a big change of management, and the same people who had involvement with this are not there anymore. And eventually, the county police chief did a search for him, and they found the hair follicles. So then the judge ordered that they test several of the follicles. They were not matching Whitley. And then they tested 3 more, and they didn't match Whitley again. And after 20-some years in prison, Drew Whitley walked out. He's living a tough life now because there's no compensation for people who are victims of wrongful conviction in Pennsylvania. 30 other states have compensation funds. In Pennsylvania, we don't. But Whitley is at least out of jail, and he's also the subject of one of my podcasts at whatitallcosts.com. The next one I want to talk to is snitches, lying snitches. In the case I want to talk about there is Joe Hall. Joe Hall was a senior in high school in Pittsburgh, happened to be driving over by Westinghouse High School in East Liberty, Homewood, when a shootout ensued and some kid got killed. Because his car was nearby, somebody identified the car. The police eventually got him, and then they found one of his friends who was supposedly with him that day, who basically said that Joe Hall pulled a gun and shot wildly into the day, which ended up causing this kid's death. There's no physical evidence. Nobody ever found the gun. In fact, the fact of the matter was the gun that supposedly existed was not the same caliber as the one that killed this kid. And it came down to where police needed somebody who could put Joe Hall in the crime. And that's where they got his supposed friend to testify or to make a police statement that Joe Hall was the shooter and Joe Hall was the killer. Well, that was a pretty much open and shut case if that was true, but it turns out the snitch, a kid named Struthers, had more to say. he made the first of several subsequent statements where he changed his story and eventually said that he totally recanted it, saying that he didn't see anything and Joe Hall had nothing to do with anything. Now, normally when your only witness with recants, the cops are going to back up, but that's not what they did here. They, in fact, went through 3 trials, let this kid testify over and over again, despite the fact that he testified that he was lying. And because of that, Joe Hall was convicted and got up to 30 years in prison. Now, when we got involved in the case of the Innocence Project, we found that there was many other pieces of evidence, including the fact there was another gun involved, including the fact that somebody else saw it and said it was not Joe Hall, and a wide assortment of other things. And despite that, Hall has not gotten any relief. In fact, he went to prison at the age of 17, and now he's in his 30s, and he's still locked up. Greg Brown was charged a year after a fire destroyed his home in Homewood that caused the death of 3 firefighters. Greg Brown had a little bit of run-in with the law beforehand, but not much. Eyewitnesses put him outside the house watching the fire, which, he said he went to the store with his mother, and then when they got back, the house was on fire, so he jumped out of the car and ran up to the house to see what was going on. Luckily, his father and sister and baby got out of the fire, and no one other than the firefighters were in there. Greg Brown goes to this reform school camp. The agents from the federal government go see all the people that stayed with him and eventually talk this kid from Eastern Pennsylvania into saying that Greg Brown told him he did it. That was enough for police to file charges against Brown and his mother because she was there with him. And he ended up on trial for 3 murders. There was no evidence that really tied Brown into the case other than the witness from the reform school. First, on the fire, they brought an expert, a supposed expert, and it said that it was intentionally set using alcohol, tobacco, and firearm testing methods. We found somebody who said, a major expert who said there was no way it was an intentional fire. In fact, it was there was a problem with their furnace that had been reported, and they also felt that it started right there. That's exactly what they thought. Apparently, the jury didn't believe that. No natural gas leak. They had the witness from the reform school, and while Greg Brown's mother was acquitted, he was convicted on all 3 counts at the age of 17 and got 3 lives. We at the Innocence Project did an award-winning expose that, first of all, there was the expert that we found said that it was a natural gas leak that caused the fire and that there was no incendiary situation they could prove that it wasn't. So secondly, we started checking this witness who said that Greg Brown told him he did this. It turns out when we found the witness out by on the eastern end of the state, he basically told us that he was coerced into making a statement and that they paid him. $15,000 was paid out to witnesses in this case. And one of the witnesses had admitted not only to us, but other people, including his the mother of his children, that he lied just to get out of jail and to get paid. Eventually, a judge ordered a new trial for Greg Brown. After he did that in Allegheny County Common Police Court, the federal government grabbed the case, and now they're charging him with federal crimes, and they're trying to take him to trial again, although his lawyers are filing all kinds of motions, including double jeopardy. In the meantime, Brown has been out on bail. Not only did he do a long period of time in prison, but now he remains in a purgatory type set because the government continues to press this case. That's misconduct. The federal government never told anyone that they paid witnesses, which even in my state-old existence as a longtime investigative reporter, I've never seen anything like that. You can see I have a lot of energy for what I do, and that's what's beautiful about journalism. Journalism is something where you can find a niche where you want to be in one particular life. I happen to follow bad guys, but I can promise you, if you choose this life, a life that I've never felt like I've ever worked one day, you're going to have a lot of fun, and you can also fall into areas of life that you want to be in. Have a great day and write well.